Hello and welcome to our webinar today. We will start in about a minute. Thanks everyone for joining. Welcome. My name is Rudolph Araujo, and I'm the VP of Marketing at Awake Security. I wanted to welcome and thank you for joining us today for our next CISO Perspectives webinar. Top 5 considerations for CISOs as post-COVID-19 re-entry progresses. They say, may you live in interesting times. Well, the good news is I think all of us can check that box. And as many organizations have started the process of opening up from the shelter in place, the interesting times continue. Today, we are joined by 2 security leaders, Malcolm Harkins, former CISO at Intel and member of Awake CISO Advisory Board, and Keith Gordon, CISO at Ally Bank. Both Keith and Malcolm have spent many years at the intersection of cybersecurity and crisis management. They're also dealing with these challenges today, so this is not something that is theoretical. And are here to share their perspectives, but hopefully also learn a thing or two from our audience. So with that said, feel free to use the Q&A and chat features to send us questions and discussion items. We will bring those in all through our session today. To begin with, I'd like to ask our panelists, Malcolm and Keith, to introduce themselves. So Keith, maybe we'll start with you.
Sure. Thanks for having me today. Again, my name is Keith Gordon. So I'm the Chief Information Security Officer at Ally Financial. Just a bit of background, if you don't know who Ally Financial is, we are an all-digital bank. We're based in Charlotte, North Carolina. But my background, as mentioned, has the last 15, 18 years has been in cybersecurity. But you can't necessarily have cybersecurity without some sort of disaster recovery or crisis management as a part of your resume, because that's pretty much what we deal with on a daily basis. It's just up until now, it's always been either some sort of cyber attack or maybe a hurricane here or there, maybe a tornado to kind of pipe in the disaster recovery team. But COVID-19 has brought a whole new sense of awareness to what does crisis management look like. So I'm looking forward to the conversation today and appreciate you having me.
Thanks, Keith. Malcolm?
Yeah, Malcolm Harkins, Chief Security and Trust Officer with Cymatic Corporation. We're an early stage web application security platform. Prior to that, I was Chief Security and Trust Officer with Silence, that was acquired by BlackBerry about a year ago. And prior to that, I lived at Intel for 24 years. And I was Intel's Chief Security and Privacy Officer, and like Keith, have dealt with a wide plethora of crisis issues, everything from insiders, active shooters, airplane disasters, Katrina, H1N1 back in the day, plus all the cyber stuff. So there's a richness of content that you can leverage from sometimes those unfortunate events to be better prepared for future ones.
All right, excellent. So let's dive in, right? So one of the things as we went into the shelter in place, most of us didn't have the luxury of preparing for it, right? I mean, we went from one day, I think Keith, you were saying you went from 90% in to 90% out in the matter of a week, right? And with that said, with the re-entry, hopefully we've had some luxury of planning. So what kind of planning should we have done, or might we have done, for this re-entry at this point? Malcolm, maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, it's funny you talk about re-entry, right? So we just had the SpaceX launch, right? There's obviously a lot of forces when you're taking off from Earth, but when you're coming in, you've got more friction, you've got more force, you've got more speed, you've got more heat. It's actually in many cases more dangerous, right? It's a controlled crash. And much like I've seen with almost anything, that reentry process is sometimes is rougher than the exit process, because the exit process, you have a sense of urgency, there's a chaos, there's a level of forgiveness with the chaos that you sometimes get. And with the reentry, you're wanting to be back to normal quicker, which can create a lot of frustrations in the business processes between executives, between different business units, between employees and businesses, their management. And so, for me, that reentry process needs to be as carefully planned. When it's the whole the plan. When you meet the enemy, the plan goes out the window, right? First contact, and the plan is not there. It's the practice of planning that builds some of the muscle memories, some of the resilience factors, some of the communication stuff. And that's why you plan. Not that the plan's going to be executed as you wrote it out, but the exercise of planning gets you prepared. And I think a lot of people prepare sometimes for the disaster, but they don't plan for the recovery. And then they actually end up in the disaster because they didn't plan the recovery well.
And that's Keith. I'd love to get your perspective on this, right? Like, is there a standard template for preparing for reentry when it comes to COVID-19? Probably not, but in general, I guess, how do you approach this?
Yeah. So as you think about, and I can remember March 11th, I had a conversation with our CEO, and we had been talking about, hey, let's do a test. Let's send everybody home. Let's see how our networks respond, but with the intent that potentially we would be coming back in. But again, let's just go send everybody home as a test. And we had been planning on that a few days out. And he said, no, I want to do it like tomorrow. So at like 3 o'clock in the afternoon on March 11th, we sent a note out to the entire company saying, go home. But what we were able to do at that point was lean back on a lot of the technical disaster recovery plans that we'd put in place, right? We had done VPN testing. We had done a lot of our other kind of network resiliency testing. So I think we were decently prepared from a technical standpoint to be able to jump into that sort of endeavor. But as you think about now, how do we go back into the office with all of the concerns? And it's not just technical. Honestly, the technical reentry is really the least of our problems. We've got some folks that we had to send home with an actual desktop, a desktop monitor, keyboard, the whole 9 yards, and they're using VDI to come back in, so it's very safe. But again, getting them set up was the easy part. Now it's okay. We got to bring them back in. We got to re-image their machines, just as a technical nature. But everybody else with a laptop, come back in and plug back in, and you're good. But it's all of the other considerations, the human factor considerations, that are really what's taking the time for us. And there was no playbook for reentry for something like this when you put in the human element. Because if you think about something as basic as going to the bathroom, well, you've got to have arrows on all of your floors leading to the bathroom. You can't come back the way that you came. You have to go all the way around the building to come back to your desk, right? And if you think about the considerations of space, okay, well, you can't bring back 100% of your people. So which percentage do you bring back? So it's all of those human factors. Plus, you've got fear in a lot of cases of folks that don't really want to come back yet because of the fear factor of continued infections and that sort of thing. So, as we think about all of those together, it's been a very tight coordination between my crisis management team and our HR partners to really bridge the gap between those two elements to help us give a really thoughtful reentry plan. And like I said, we went from I went from 99% in the office to 8 days later, 99% remote, pretty much without a hitch. And we did that, like I said, in 8 days. But now we're on about our 4th week of reentry planning, or 5th week of reentry planning, and we're not even close to having an effective plan, knowing how to bring people back in where they feel comfortable.
And to add to that complexity, there's the decision of, am I going to put infrared screeners and check people's temperatures as they approach the door? What if my kids' childcare isn't open up or school's not back in session? So there's well beyond just the individual. There's all the privacy concerns around that stuff. There's well, if my employer knows that I might have been sick, what does that mean? Am I going to be ostracized? I mean, like you said, you have all these fear factors. And then you have, if somebody, let's say, came to work and then a few weeks later, they find out they're sick and they don't show back up. Now you've got to figure out, do I send everybody home? How do I do the equivalent of a biohazard deep clean response for the offices and all the stuff? The internal employee contact tracing, right? And that again just widens out the complexity of the human, fear and other issues that then brings along a wide array of privacy risks, security risks. And so again, you think it's going to be small, but it just starts weaving itself out.
Yeah, I mean, Keith, in one of the previous webinars you did with us, you brought up this topic about, the CISO and the security team having a seat at the table, right? If nothing else, I guess this is an opportunity to certainly, be part of that larger decision-making process. It sounds like from what both of you are saying. Yes.
Well, in our case, we have something called the Executive Crisis Management Team, or ECMT. And I co-chair that with our Chief Risk Officer. So when we enacted our ECMT, which was the first time we had done it in, I think, 6 years, due to a crisis, that the ECMT is our CEO, his entire leadership team, our Chief Physical Security Officer, and myself. So you think about the interaction model and who they're looking to help drive the entire company. I always used to think that it was great that I could have a good dialogue with our CEO, every few weeks, maybe every month or so, something like that. But now it's, almost sometimes every day and every other day. So it's really cemented the fact that the CISO of today is no longer just the cyber guy. It's the crisis management function. And how do we manage the company in all types of perils, and how do we respond to it and recover from it?
Yeah, and it's probably even getting up to the board level, right? Because this is
absolutely.
not just a technical issue, to the point you made earlier.
Absolutely, that's right. Because when I go present to the board now, my next update will more than likely be probably fairly significantly around COVID-19, with a tad bit on my cyber program.
Yeah, well, and I think, Keith, you said something, really important. I think in Rudolph, you had hit on it, the seat at the table. And I think it does create the opportunity for the seat at the table. I would still venture to say, though, 50% or more of traditional CISOs still don't have that seat at the table because they're the IT security person and the HR team, the physical security team. If in your manufacturing, the chief safety officer is driving all this stuff, and the InfoSec team. If a company had a pandemic plan, it sat with safety, physical security, and HR. IT wasn't even anywhere near it, and security InfoSec was even further away from it. And so they're still trying to get connected to it. And I think, because I've talked to many peers that are in that traditional CISO role, and unfortunately for them, they still don't have that. It's closer now, but they're not driving the ship. They're a cog in the wheel. And I think, Keith, we've chatted before. I think there's an interplay between all these things that, like you said, with your ECMT, right, that emergency management crisis team. And it's the same way at Intel. When I was there, we had a corporate emergency operations center team. For a while, when I was first getting into security, I was a part of it as the InfoSec person. And then, it was probably 2006, 2007, I ran the entire corporate emergency operations center team, and same at Silence and now at Cymatic. So it really just depends upon, I think, the maturation, the individual, the structures that are at play in various companies.
Yeah, that's actually, we just got an audience question that kind of fits into that same bucket, which is, what are the top 2 or 3 tips for someone that isn't having that success, even and in spite of this COVID situation, to get that seat at the table? I know this could be a webinar in itself, by the way. So maybe we can focus on a couple of things and then we move on to some of the other topics.
Keith, you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, a couple things is, as you think about your role or your team, whatever that is, you always want to make sure that you are aligning to corporate strategies, but also, in some cases, more importantly, what are the top risks to your company? And how can you help solve those risks or help manage or mitigate those risks? And in our case right now, you think about the balance of cyber being one of the top risks to our company, while we've got currently the current pandemic as another operating top risk to our company. And how can we bring the wherewithal of my team to bear in both cases? We're continuing to protect the company from a data standpoint. If you think about, what is in many cases the root of our team names, it's information security or information protection at the base of the fundamentals. And if you look at how we've evolved the operating model, of people working from home, third parties working from home, understanding a different way of working, information security then becomes a core fundamental to how to protect the company. Even if you don't have the crisis management as a part of your function, you still have the information security as a core foundation.
Yeah, and I think if people don't have that seat at the table, whether it be for this type of thing or even more broadly, there's 2 primary reasons for that. One, their executive team doesn't see them as competent or confident enough or capable enough to have that seat at the table. Or 2, they haven't demonstrated. Either way, you've got to do a self-reflection and say, what is it that I'm doing or not doing that is causing me to be kind of out of that game? You kind of have to earn your seat at the table. And sometimes you can do that just from, frankly, things happening. And, cream always rises at the top. If you're the one who's providing the insight, the wisdom, the sense of urgency, but the calm and able to wrangle in all the ambiguity, you're going to be in charge next time.
Yeah.
If you're adding to it and you're running around like a chicken with their head cut off, and then frankly whining that nobody's listening to you, you're going to continue to be ignored. So you got to do it. You own it. If you don't have a seat at the table, it's your fault, frankly.
Yeah, that's right. And one other thing you mentioned around, if you raise a risk, don't just raise the risk. You've got to come with a solution also, because we get a lot of people that are, in Malcolm's words, the chickens, running around, and that just gets to be noise, and especially in a crisis situation. But if you're bringing that risk, but then coming to the table with, hey, I've identified this, here's how I think we can solve it, let me go do it. Am I good? All right, let me roll. So it's that really proactiveness, I think, in this stage is where I don't have to necessarily think about that, because I've got to worry about where we're going. And if I can bring other people alongside me that are ready and willing just to go solve things, that's really where the rubber meets the road for me.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Keith. One of the things that I learned a long, long time ago when I was back at Intel, and then Thad Allen, who used to be the admiral in charge of the Coast Guard, who's now at Booz Allen, who had responded to Katrina and took over when FEMA had kind of failed, and responded to the BP oil Gulf spill a few years ago. Him and I were on stage talking about crisis management from a few different things. And he said something very, very poignant that has stuck with me, but I think he was right. I just didn't simplify it the way in which he did. He said, the most important thing in any crisis is unity of effort and unity of command. And when you don't have that, you have chaos, and that will then magnify the issues. And, so I would, challenge people to think about that in whatever they're doing, the response or the recovery, and go, how do I achieve unity of effort and unity of command? And in many cases for me, like you said, your structure involved your CEO and stuff like that, I always design my response processes to keep the corporate officers out of it because I didn't see them as good crisis managers. I needed them for a couple things. One, to have distance. So in case I screwed it up, I'm the person they can fire, right? And two, to make decisions. Otherwise, don't muck with the machinery. Let me and the rest of everybody else do it because that's my job. And your job is to make decisions, oversee. And then if I screw it up, you're preserving the role of the CEO, the general counsel, and stuff like that. And so I also saw it as my role to preserve them in case the crisis went sideways, that they were not, in essence, impacting the company. It was, I bore the burden of that responsibility if the response got screwed up.
Interesting.
That's actually a good segue into another question around, what's the readiness criteria to know you're ready for reentry, right? I mean, again, this is a war and peace kind of question, I guess. So we could be here for a few days, but at a high level, I mean, are there things that you definitely want to have on that checklist?
Yeah, for us, it's varied over the past few weeks on what do we think some of those criteria could look like. It was everything from, are schools going to be back in session as one potential criteria. Another is, what's the fatality percentage based upon total number of infections? Or it could be, what is the, not just state, but down to the county level, what are their restrictions and are they easing restrictions? And then honestly, it could get down to employee sentiment too, in some cases, where if we've got a significant percentage of our employee base that says, listen, I'm not ready to come back into the office for whatever reasons, if it's fear, uncertainty, doubt, whatever that may look like, that's going to be another criteria. But what we're doing right now is we're trying to build a model that says, how do you bring all of that together to get to a rational, data-driven decision as much as possible, right? This is the art of the impossible, I think, right now, of trying to figure out what that golden gun is to get you back in. But we're just trying to make whatever that risk-tolerant decision is for our company.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Rudolph.
Yeah, so Malcolm, one kind of nuance I wanted to throw into that, right, based on a question that we just got, is how do you think about that also in the context of the security team itself, right? Because these are also people that also have their fear and doubts, and you've got all processes. So how do you adapt that as well when dealing with the cybersecurity team?
Well, for me, I look at it and I've had the luxury that most of my team, all of my years running security, was spread out all over the place. And so by and large, there was a high level of remoteness to what they were doing anyways. Or if they were responding to an incident in the middle of the night, guess what? They're doing it from home anyways. And so for me, I just go, stay remote, because they could do basically everything they need to do. Heck, you could do a remote image and start working on forensics. There's some investigative things that are more appropriate for being on site, right? And things like that, and some of the toolings and labs that you might have and stuff like that. But if it's not from that nature, stay remote. The other thing I was going to mention relative to the comment on the reentry is the context of the organization, right? Think of grocery stores. Yeah, they had to make some changes, right? Costco, Sam's, all those things, but they're working. Manufacturing environments, think of what Tesla did just a few weeks ago and ignored the Alameda County stuff. Their reentry was, I need to build stuff, right? So they did it. And so the context will shift sometimes the readiness for reentry, because if you're going out of business because you can't produce anything, well, guess what? That means you're ready to reenter regardless of all that stuff, and you just have to manage the risk, right? Yeah. So I think it's context dependent. If you're truly an office type environment, then the context is a little bit different. But if you're in the physical environment with the services you do, the manufacturing of things, your reentry might be purely driven based upon economics. We're going to go out of business unless we start, doing things now.
Keith, any insights with working with the security team itself? How do you deal with maybe changed processes for the SOC, for incident response, things like that?
Yeah, it was interesting. From a SOC perspective, we've got very tight coordination between security and fraud, physical security and network security from an operational standpoint, very tightly connected. And like Malcolm, they all don't necessarily sit right next to each other. So it's a virtual engagement already. You can go from, you've got the video screens up on the walls. Well, now it's just you display it on another kind of monitor in your office, right? So it was a pretty easy transition for us just to go to a virtual SOC for everything. One of the things that Malcolm was mentioning around how do we manage through the security team being remote, and are they okay being remote? Well, to your point, my team has pretty much been able to operate seamlessly outside of the office. One of the things I think that's taught us as an entire company is historically, even being a digital bank, we have operated from an agile perspective, very communal, a lot of kind of face-to-face demos, a lot of that, that traditional agile Scrum capability. But what we've realized, and our CEO has even come back to say, you know what, we're operating pretty effectively in this remote scenario. So we don't have to go back into the office. We're not forced to go back. We don't have to go build widgets, right? Because our widgets are code, and you can do code anywhere. So there are very few operations that we've realized in our company that have to be either in an office situation or in any kind of face-to-face kind of situation.
Yeah, I think the events of the last 2 months or 3 months has maybe taught us that offices may be overrated to some extent. I know we were talking about this in the prep. Our real estate prices are dropping, etc. So now that Elon Musk has come up twice in our conversation already, let's move on to the next phase, right? So now you've prepped for reentry. Now you're in the reentry. So let's spend a little bit of time talking about what I think some people are already in and some people are almost going to be in. Do we wind down the crisis team? Is the crisis over? Do we move on? Malcolm, what's your thoughts on that?
There is a level of what I'd say turnover back to the business that you have to think about and slowly loosen your grip, right? But be there as the backstop, right? Should they struggle with the normalization of things. And so I think that's typical of any crisis, physical, logical, COVID-19. It's what I've seen over and over and over again. The one thing that's, I think, going to be different with COVID-19 is I'm not a medical officer, stuff like that, but I personally believe that there'll be a resurgence. And again, so you have to start thinking about, again, the theoretical things we were chatting about earlier and the ripple effect of those. What if this has seasonality that never goes away? Maybe what if we have weakened the human race enough in our immunity with the things that we've done that every 2 to 3 years we're going to be in this type of situation? So we have to start contemplating that and then think about then how does that, because if you're constantly going back into crisis mode, like we've done on the cyber side, because we've done a crappy job of managing the security of some of that stuff, then you're going to be in this constant crisis mode, and that's going to get wearing and stuff on things. So I think there's some level of, that reentry that you have to walk away from and loosen your grip, but be prepared to step in. And then you've got to start thinking about the knock-on effects of this and how this might reoccur and what that reoccurrence frequency would be, and how do you not get back into such a significant crisis mode and take the learnings from this, and then every time you're reducing the chaos, because I think that's honestly what I would be doing. I'd be thinking about the next quote unquote pandemic or something like it, and then how to be in a better spot for that.
I mean, it almost sounds like, and Keith would love to get your thoughts on this. It almost sounds like there's like a little Goldilocks kind of effect that you got to factor in here, right? You don't want to be totally like life's back to normal, let's party kind of thing, versus at the same time, be in such a paranoia mode that reentry isn't really reentry. Keith, how are you thinking about that? Both internally at Ally, but just in general as you talk to your peers and things like that.
Yeah, sure. So, from an evolutionary perspective, going back to March 12th, which was our first day out of the office, we were literally meeting every single day with our CEO and his leadership team in that it truly was crisis of how do we operate as a company. And then, about a month and a half later, we're like, you know what, we could probably scale that back to 3 times a week. We're kind of in the middle of trying to figure out, yep, we're operating okay. And then, about a month later, we're like, you know what, we're in the beginning stages of developing that reentry plan. We're not in crisis necessarily because we're operating effectively as a company, but now we've got to, as a crisis team, figure out what's the most effective way to begin to come back to any sense of normalcy in an office. So we probably will keep our crisis management team activated until there's a vaccine, more than likely, right? Because up until that point, to Malcolm's comment a little bit earlier, there could be a resurgence, and we don't have any other way to respond to it other than go back to kind of where we were or where we have been over the past few months.
Yeah, you go to a warm down mode and you say, hey, once a month, we're just going to do a quick touch base, see how things are going, half an hour long meeting. We could spend more if we need to. But that way you're not completely disbanded.
That's right.
And then having to spin back up, because that spin back up creates a level of chaos and confusion and fatigue. And so if you stay in that warm down mode until you feel ready to completely shut off, I completely agree. That's exactly how I handle similar things.
So, this brings up another question, Malcolm and Keith, that, Keith, you touched on a little bit earlier, right? How do you balance this and handle this with the fact that some of your suppliers, your third parties, are also going to be in varying stages of reentry? And, one of the questions we got from the audience is, what's the strategy around managing that third party risk in this time, and any recommendations on tools and automation to deal with that?
Yeah, sure. So that was one of those early light bulb moments of, oh, yeah, I didn't think about that initially because we were so worried about getting our folks, out of our office situations. But then as our third party started coming to us and saying, hey, we've got to send our folks home too. And they might be in the Philippines, they might be in India, they might be wherever in the world. So what we had to do then is kind of create a bridge between third-party risk, cyber risk, and then interacting directly with those kind of third-party suppliers to ensure that, if they were going to be sending their folks home, we added a contractual addendum to their existing contract that really helped build some liability around the fact that in a lot of these cases, these folks were in clean rooms with physical security surroundings, that they were no longer going to have those physical security surroundings. But then getting back to, again, the root of my team's responsibility is around protecting information and data, and getting down to the understanding of what data elements do those third parties have access to, for why they're in a clean room anyway, and then put in technical solutions to either mask that data, tokenize that data, or just flat out remove it, so we can remove the risk as much as possible, right? And there were a couple situations where it was a part of their business process to be able to have full access to it. So that's when you put on the big brother hat, put all kinds of monitoring on them. You tell them you're watching them, you're watching every keystroke, and recording everything that they do, right? So it's where you have to have additional controls is where kind of data is needed. But in all cases, if you kind of think about like from a PCI standpoint, if any of you guys have had PCI implications, really the goal is to reduce the amount of PAN data in your environment. It's the exact same scenario that we're walking through here with our third parties.
So it sounds like you've got a process that kicked in as part of this, and it almost sounds like that's going to be now the new normal, because we have no idea how many times you're going to go back and forth with this. Is that a fair?
Yeah, absolutely. And interestingly, it's created a benefit for us in some cases where we've completely removed any PII data access for these third parties, that there's potentially no real need for that clean room anymore. And in theory, we could source those people wherever we want to now, right? So it's created some really interesting opportunities for us where, maybe in some contact centers where, maybe you pay them $15 an hour and, they're going into this clean room and they really hate their job and whatever, because you have to have so much oversight over them. But now you've removed some of those barriers. Now you can maybe go hire somebody else, maybe a little bit higher quality, let them work from home because we've got the right controls around it. So it's created some interesting business value opportunities for us.
Yeah, that's pretty cool that you guys were able to innovate. I mean, I guess they always say necessity is the mother of innovation, right? So, so nothing like a crisis to kind of deal with that. But Malcolm, any other thoughts on kind of risks to consider when you're in that reentry process? What kind of cadence to kind of keep, from a reporting perspective?
Yeah, well, there's a couple things. Well, one of the things we haven't talked about yet is employee travel, right? And what happens if somebody feels uncomfortable? Again, that's like going into the workplace. Somebody wants them, to be at a meeting and stuff like that. So there's that component that people need to think through, from the physical safety concerns. The logical concerns are no different than normal travel type stuff. But I think even on the third party thing, and Keith, I think you touched on a little bit. This is an opportunity to look at it and go, has the marketplace for third-party risk driven us to do things that we didn't really need to do, right? Because I mean, I do third-party risk. I believe people need to do it, but I think we've approached it like the year 2000, and some of us are old enough to remember that, where I'm going to go touch everybody and I'm going to worry that they're, all their stuff is taken care of. And I think there's some aspects of it that's very appropriate and sufficiently detailed. There's some of it that, frankly, is because I've sent them out, but I've been a SaaS provider now a few times, so I get a lot of third-party risk questionnaires, and I get the vulnerability screen that somebody did, that 50% of it was a bunch of false positives that makes me do a bunch of wasted work. So I think it's a good opportunity to rethink how we're doing third-party risk, and really, are we getting the benefit out of it from a risk management perspective, or is it a check-the-box compliance thing? If it's a check-the-box compliance thing, figure out how to check the box simpler, quicker, and easier, because it'll save everybody a lot of time, money, and effort.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I'm hearing from both you and Keith is, having the right controls in place so that you make sure your data that needs to be protected is protected. And, at that point, from a threat model perspective, you've made sure, irrespective of what that third party does, you're in a good, in as good a place as possible, right? And maybe this crisis has actually forced us down that path to some extent.
Yeah, well, and for me, all of my critical suppliers that have always touched something that could have a risk that I'm worried about, I know my peer in that organization and I have routine one-on-ones with them. And I'd rather trust knowing somebody and how they think and how they act and what they do and their character than the 500 answers to their questionnaire. Because the person who called me up and said, we have this issue, it's not public yet, here's what we're doing about it, but I want to give you a heads up. Those are the people I trust the most. And so I would encourage people if they, again, go to the criticality of it and then go establish the rapport and the relationship with your partner there, because they are your partner. You're dependent upon them and they contribute to your risk. And they should treat you that way and have a relationship with you, and just, then clean up all the paperwork back and forth stuff. What I did at Silence, what I did at Intel, what I'm doing with Cymatic. I've had dialogues with our customers and it's like, hey, I can fill out your questionnaire, but let's have a real dialogue and relationship. Here's my cell phone number. Ever have a question, you ever have an issue, call me. If we have one that I think impacts you, even if it's indirectly, I'll call you too.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm looking at a couple of the audience comments, and I think we can establish that no one likes questionnaires.
The givers and the receivers of them.
Exactly. So to use your analogy from earlier, Malcolm, we've the capsule has landed, right? We've been picked out of the ocean. We're depressurized. We're now in the post-reentry phase. Is this the time to kind of go back and do a postmortem of our BCP plans? I mean, speaking of questionnaires, et cetera, or do we throw it all out and start from scratch? What's the guidance there?
Oh, every incident, even the smallest ones, we always did a postmortem, and sometimes it's just as easy as getting the right 10 or 15 people on a call and debating what everybody saw, because everybody has their own truth because they saw an angle. And sometimes they'd say, hey, Malcolm, while you were running, this emergency thing, you made this and this and this mistake. I didn't tell you about it then because you didn't need to know. I just ignored what you told me to do and I did this instead. Okay, great. I need feedback too, right? So we have to do the postmortem on us as the leaders and how we responded to the unity of effort, the unity of command, the care and feeding of ourselves, the teams, the company, but also all the technical details. So for me, depending upon, like for COVID-19, it would be a wide angle one. I'd want HR to do their postmortem. I'd want basically unit by unit that was affected to do their individual postmortem. And I would sit in all of them as just a listener. And then I would aggregate all of that as a company one. And then we would do a postmortem of the emergency response team and what we did right, what we did wrong, what we'd do differently.
Yeah, and for us, it's almost been an evolutionary response to, are we effective or not? One of the things that we did very early on was we started doing pulse checks with our entire employee base, just literally on a weekly basis. Hey, how are we doing? Here are some things. Tell us how you're feeling. Tell us what your thoughts are on these elements. And literally every week we have different pulse questions that we're asking them, but they're really focused in on decisions that we may have made a week or two beforehand, an execution that we had done, to really see the implications down to the grassroots of the entire company. So for us, it's been absolutely, we want to get that response back quickly so that then we can, if we made a misstep, that we can recover and quicker than waiting to do till this thing's closed out and then do a full postmortem. The interesting thing around like policies, as an example, I think I told you guys earlier that we had this great pandemic plan that every year, and literally I'd just gone to our board like 2 weeks beforehand to get our pandemic plan reapproved, not knowing what was happening or what was coming. And literally we cracked open that pandemic plan. We were going to begin executing on it. We started looking at it like, throw this thing out. We're going to have to rewrite it at some point in the future, because this is a whole new idea of tactical crisis management that we've never had to deal with. So pandemic plans got to get rewritten. Our disaster recovery plans from a physical standpoint have been rewritten. I mean, if you think about how you usually have had disaster recovery sites for your locations, like something bad happens at your core location, where are you going to send people? Well, now it's kind of like, well, we've proven that we can send 99% people home and we're good. The interesting thing, though, is we're now having to think about it from a reverse angle of, let's say you've got let's use a hurricane as an example. We've got an office in Jacksonville. Let's say that we've got massive power outages or internet connectivity outages at the kind of mass population perspective. Well, guess what? Our main building has generators. We've got redundancy from internet connectivity. So it's almost like, do we need to have a reverse disaster recovery or business continuity plan to potentially bring folks back in the event of some sort of kind of physical disaster now? So it's been a really interesting dialogue to think through the dynamics of this.
Yeah, and you bring up an interesting point, and again, when I was back at Intel, silence was a little bit different, but, we had the Fukushima incident, right? An earthquake in Japan. I just landed in Singapore and we activated the CEOC and stuff like that, and wide scale set of things. We had some employees that had to stay in our offices in downtown Tokyo for a couple days before they could get home. Right. And so there is a little bit of when you think of shelter in place, that depending upon the context, the office might be the shelter. And then you have to think about family, and do you allow that? What about kids? And again, those are contingencies that if you have a large campus, you have more flexibility to perhaps contemplate. And even with COVID-19, and one of the things I was incredibly proud of Jason and Paul, the Cymatic co-founders, as it started occurring and some of the lockdowns happened, I went to them because, again, my experience with some of this stuff, and I said, look, one of the other things that we have to consider is the repercussions on our employees, not only from being remote, but they might have additional expenses that are coming because price of food might go up. They have to stock up on some things. And depending upon people's economic situation, that might put them in a level of debt. They might have to float money on credit cards. And then if this has a ripple effect, what does that then do? Or they've got a spouse who's in one thing and all of a sudden their bonuses are gone. And so there's a financial toll that could happen for your employees. And what we did, and literally in a 5-minute thing, once I proposed, in essence, kind of a payroll loan, if somebody asked and needed it, that we would, in essence, prepay them, half a month's or a month's salary in order to give them some financial flexibility so they didn't end up in a debt situation that would be long-lived. And so, again, there's things like that depending upon the context of your business, that you can sometimes do that alleviates the stressors at home that will exacerbate other risk issues. Right. And so I would encourage people to, again, think about widely when you do your postmortems and you think about this. Could we have done other things for our employees that would have reduced their stress, made them more productive, made them perhaps less likely end up on a slippery slope that could, create an insider risk, right? Because they're now, financially pressured and might cut corners on something for some reason.
Yeah, that's a very interesting perspective because, like you said, I mean, ultimately, all of these things lead to risk, right? And it kind of segues into another topic I wanted to hit on, which is, how do you recognize people in this time too, right? I mean, the people clearly went above and beyond. There's a lot of heroes, like just at Awake, for instance. We're not a very big company, but there's a lot of people that went above and beyond, and I'm sure at larger companies as well. I mean, any thoughts, ideas that you guys have put into action at your ends?
I mean, I know for us, to your point, I mean, it's literally been hundreds of people that have had to engage, everything from technology folks getting, literally laptops, peripherals, whatever that might look like, out to folks. Crazy enough, one of the hardest things for us to find were these stinking headsets. One of my leaders, one of my direct reports, literally had to go take almost a week and a half and go try to find headsets, right? So it's how do you respond to someone? Well, he got a funny nickname by one of our executive committee members, right? So you can't just say, hey, great job, here's $10,000, right? Because financially that doesn't make sense considering the current circumstance. But what we have done is we've given visibility, we've given personal thank yous. One of the things that we did even as a technology leadership team, we created this funny little video, but it was really calling every person like, you're our hero. And, we acted like we were giving them an award. We got an opportunity to say a few things, linked it all together, even though we were remote. Hey, it's like, you grab the envelope and you hand it to the next guy, right? So it's even virtual. So it's little things like that we've been able to do to help highlight the fact that we know what you've been doing. We appreciate what you've been doing, and just kind of big heartfelt thank yous. So it's really been a lot of the little things like that, more so than the big bang stuff.
Yeah, I would agree. In keeping it authentic, keeping it real, keeping it localized. Sometimes it could be as simple as a handwritten thank you letter mailed to somebody's home, and then inside it, a thank you note to their partner and their kids, right, for what their parent did for the company. I mean, those things, when I've done them or when I've received them, some of them are still around my office when I've gotten stuff like that, right? And so I'd say keep it real, keep it authentic, keep it personal. And if somebody did sacrifice time away from family or kids or something like that, note that, and also thank the people at home, because they also sacrifice too, by not having the parent around in some cases. So and then if there is a true hero, somebody who came up with an innovative thing that saved the day and kept you from wasting millions of dollars on doing something that would have been traditional, those are the people you write the $10,000 check to, or $1,000 check. And I've done those a couple times, because there sometimes is that couple people or one person that you go, boy, if they weren't there, we would have face planted. And those people you put up, but you also have to recognize some people don't like being on the stage or on the pillar in that recognition. So if somebody doesn't like that, do it quietly as well, because you can also create other issues if you recognize somebody too broadly and that's just not who they are.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was talking to a CISO of a pharmaceutical company last week, and he said the biggest risk he's concerned about moving forward is actually the psychological impact of this. And Malcolm, you kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, right? I mean, the potential for insider threats or even inadvertent insider threats. But it was interesting. He wasn't worried about technical risk. He wasn't worried about a lot of the other things as much as he was worried about the long-term mental impact of this.
There is a level of potential PTSD. I mean, think about it. If I'm working from home, I've got that stress, my kids and their school and all that stuff. A lot of people escape their stresses at home by going to work, right? And again, I hate to bring this up, but I'll just share it. I mean, there are abusers out there. And if somebody's at home and their partner is abusive and they can't escape from it, that's going to take a toll on them. After Katrina, when I was at Intel, even though we didn't have operations there, I spent a lot of money in Katrina response. Rented motorhomes, believe it or not, and had people drive in to help set up wireless and rewrite the onboarding for Red Cross's application and help with that. My biggest thing was they were so frustrated with the screwed up response. There was that, in essence, angst and PTSD from being in those environments. So that's a real risk. If that's not something that people are contemplating, they should discuss it with their HR. They should, if they have the equivalent of the warm lines and stuff, encourage it. But we as managers and leaders need to recognize that, because it will have an impact on the company and on the workplace. And the question just becomes how.
Yeah, so we've got a couple more questions, I think, before we wrap up. So one question, which is again a little bit more tactical, I guess, is what are some of the lessons learned, right? Like, one example that came up here is we realized we didn't have any visibility of people coming in over the VPN because, we never planned for the entire company to come over the VPN, right? Some of our processes clearly broke. How do we rationally, kind of assess where we as a security team kind of maybe didn't have the right processes, didn't have the right tools, right? And Malcolm, you touched on this a little bit earlier. It's important to be transparent and fair. I mean, any thoughts there on how to think about?
Well, I think it's just having an open dialogue and saying, okay, again, where did our security controls impede managing other risks and encumber the response processes? Again, having owned physical, logical product and stuff like that, I could always do that because I'd always see the other side. And if the security, that's an honest dialogue to have and say, where did we contribute to the failures of our response, and what could we do better? Or in some cases, again, I know it's the necessity, and Keith, you talked about having people bring their desktops home, right? That's an adequate response. Or, I've seen some people who just said, screw it, we're going to enable full BYOD. We're going to put up a portal for our employees, get rid of the VPN, get rid of all that cost, speed it up, and innovate our way out of it. But I've also heard that some people rented U-Hauls and they were delivering the desktops and stuff to people's homes. And I'm going, oh, good God, that's ridiculous. So I think, if you've done stuff like that, look at it and go, was that, again, necessary? Or were we just following our traditional approach and we weren't innovating? And in some cases, I'm not going to criticize one or another, but in some cases, I think there's innovation that could have occurred that would have lowered cost while still managing the risks.
Yeah, and totally agree with that. The one addition I will say is I have to be, not just me in general, but as technicians, I think as a part of this reentry recovery process, we need to continue to be reminded that this is a human challenge more than a technical problem, because we're ready to go knock some great solution out, get hands on keyboards, go figure something out. Hey, we're ready to go. All right, go back in the office, when everyone may be like, oh, wait, no, we're not ready. So it's just a reminder that this is more of a people and a mental leap that we've got to make for reentry than it is a technical solution. And as technologists, sometimes we always kind of run to the barn back to technology. And sometimes we need just to keep reminded that it's that.
Right. And Rudolph, to the question on the VPN and stuff like that, I've said this before, probably in other webinars we've done. I think sometimes we get too wrapped around the axle calculating risk, checking the box for compliance stuff versus contemplating things. If you never contemplated that your employees would have to be fully remote, I don't think you were adequately doing your job to contemplate the risk issues that you might face. And as harsh as that sounds, that's your job, is to contemplate those things, figure out mitigation for them, and be ready for the black swan event, because they occur. Pandemics occurred. If you weren't prepared to think about having a pandemic, shame on you.
I mean, I guess maybe the good news is at least now you don't have that excuse, right? Because now now it's no longer maybe a black swan event in the traditional sense of the word. It's occurred, and it's likely to reoccur. If depending on all of the science around this, right? So
yeah, and there might be other things like a pandemic. So because this is now real, go contemplate some of those other things and be ready for those as well. Because what I've found through years of disaster recovery, business continuity planning drills, drill in the extreme to be prepared for the ordinary. There's some crazy drills that we've done and stuff that I've managed. And every one of them has provided a benefit to a common event, that you couldn't have forecasted until it occurred. Did a solar flare crazy thing years ago. And then when that volcano went off in Iceland that disrupted shipping routes and planes and people getting stuck, I'm like, oh crap, the tune-up we did because of a crazy drill that we did on solar flares that created worldwide communications and travel and other stuff. And, you know, a 48-hour follow the sun drill that we did one time, it helped us for preparing for something I never would have thought about, a volcano eruption that disrupted things 6 months later. So again, it's, you know, I really just encourage people to get a little, it seems far-fetched, but sometimes those mental exercises can be worth it if you don't go too far and then seem like, you know, you need to be wearing a tinfoil hat or something.
Wow. So that, you know, we've hit a whole wide range of topics today, from, you know, from solar flares to pandemics, right? I want to thank Malcolm and Keith, you know, the great insight as always. I want to thank our audience for being, you know, very interactive and keeping us on our toes with your questions and comments. We hope to keep this conversation going on, you know, this is not something that's going to be done. So follow us on social media. You know, I know Malcolm and Keith, you know, post on social as well. So, you know, in the meantime, you know, thanks again for attending. If you'd like to share or view the recording, it's always available on awakesecurity.com/webinars or on our YouTube channel. And we look forward to seeing you again. Thanks again. Thanks, Malcolm. Thanks, Keith. And everyone have a great rest of the week.
Great. Thanks, Rudolph.